9. The Civil Rights Movement in the U.S. More than Martin Luther King. Welcome to today's episode. When we think of the Civil Rights Movement in the United States, one name usually comes to mind, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His leadership, speeches, and nonviolent philosophy became iconic, and rightfully so. But the movement was bigger than one man. It was built by thousands of courageous individuals, activists, students, labor organizers, lawyers, women, and youth, many of whom have been overlooked by history. Their collective action reshaped America's laws, institutions, and global image. And it didn't stop at the U.S. border. The Civil Rights Movement inspired and was inspired by global struggles for freedom, from South Africa to India to the Caribbean. Its influence continues today in movements for justice around the world. So today, we're looking beyond Dr. King, highlighting lesser-known figures, exploring global connections, and examining the ripple effects of one of the most important social movements of the 20th century. The Civil Rights Movement was never just about a dream, it was about demanding real change in law, power, and society. And it was never led by just one man. It was a movement of millions, with many voices, some loud and some quiet, but all essential. So today, as we honor Dr. King, let's also remember Diane Nash, Fred Shuttlesworth, Joe N. Robinson, James Farmer, Claudette Colvin, Gloria Richardson, and countless others whose names may not appear in textbooks but whose courage and organizing changed the world. 1. Roots of the movement. The struggle for civil rights didn't begin in the 1950s. It had deep roots in black resistance going back centuries, in slave rebellions, Reconstruction-era activism, and early 20th century organizing that laid the foundation for what was to come. Groups like the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded in 1909, were fighting legal battles long before the movement captured headlines. Leaders like Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall used the courts to chip away at segregation, most famously with Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which declared school segregation unconstitutional. But even before that victory, they were building a slow, strategic legal campaign aimed at dismantling the legal framework of Jim Crow. Meanwhile, black churches, labor unions, community organizations, and historically black colleges were becoming training grounds for resistance. Black Americans were not passive victims, they were organizers, educators, and agitators, often risking everything to assert their rights. By the mid-20th century, conditions were shifting. World War II had exposed American contradictions, a country fighting for freedom abroad while denying it at home. Black veterans returned with a new sense of urgency and entitlement to full citizenship. At the same time, the emerging Cold War put pressure on the U.S. To address its racial inequalities, America's global image was tarnished by images of segregation and brutality. And so, a new generation, often young, black, and Southern, stepped up to challenge Jim Crow directly. These were high school and college students, ministers, sharecroppers, teachers, and everyday citizens, using direct action to force the nation to confront its contradictions. 2. Beyond King, hidden heroes of the movement. Their stories remind us that the civil rights movement was collective, grassroots, and diverse, not a single man's mission, but a people's revolution. Ella Baker didn't stand at podiums or lead marches, but she shaped the very soul of the movement. She believed that movements shouldn't depend on charismatic leaders alone, but on empowered communities. It was her quiet guidance that helped shape SNCC, a student-led group that would redefine direct action through sit-ins, voter drives, and grassroots organizing. Bayard Rustin, despite being one of the sharpest strategic minds in the movement, was often pushed into the shadows because of his sexuality and past political affiliations. Yet it was Rustin who trained King in nonviolence, and it was Rustin who built the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, one of the most iconic events in American history. Diane Nash, then a college student in Nashville, was just 21 when she challenged segregation head-on. She helped coordinate the Freedom Rides, risking her life as buses were firebombed and activists were attacked. When federal officials warned her to stop, she calmly replied, "We all signed our wills before we left." Her fearlessness helped push the Kennedy administration to take civil rights seriously. Joe and Robinson, whose overnight mimeographing of 50,000 leaflets after Rosa Parks' arrest helped launch the Montgomery bus boycott. 3. Global connections, inspiration across borders. The civil rights movement didn't happen in isolation. It was both globally influenced and globally influential, part of a broader tide of 20th century resistance against colonialism, white supremacy, and authoritarianism. Mahatma Gandhi's legacy of nonviolent resistance in India left a deep impression on American civil rights leaders. Dr. King called his trip to India in 1959 a pilgrimage, and he returned even more convinced that moral force could defeat oppressive systems. Gandhi's ideas weren't just symbolic, they became tactical blueprints for sit-ins, boycotts, and mass civil disobedience. As African Americans confronted segregation and racist violence in the United States, leaders and movements around the world took notice. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela and members of the African National Congress, ANC, studied the U.S. struggle closely. The anti-apartheid movement adopted many of the same tactics: protests, legal challenges, international solidarity campaigns, while also borrowing the language of human rights and moral justice. In the Caribbean, where colonial powers were losing their grip, the civil rights movement energized black consciousness and independence movements. Activists in Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados looked to the U.S. for models of grassroots organizing and racial pride. Figures like Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, born in Trinidad and active in SNCC, helped link black power in America to Pan-Africanism abroad. Meanwhile, in Latin America, civil rights imagery of peaceful marches met with brutality resonated with activists resisting military regimes, economic inequality, and police violence. In Brazil, for example, where racism was officially denied but deeply embedded in society, black activists began to cite the U.S. movement when demanding recognition of Afro-Brazilian culture, rights, and identity. It also pushed international institutions to act. The United Nations, newly shaped by decolonization, began paying closer attention to racial inequality. Civil rights leaders like Malcolm X and Dr. King both began appealing to global audiences, not just for solidarity, but to place U.S. racism in the context of global injustice. 4. Ripple effects. The movement's legacy. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 struck down literacy tests and other tools of black voter suppression. Public schools, lunch counters, buses, and workplaces were legally desegregated.